I want to show you some numbers, and this is courtesy of the Lincoln Inspection Service and our colleague Mark Fulmer there. And the aflatoxin test results that they've been conducting on samples that were submitted voluntarily and of some carloads coming through from early August until mid-September. This is over 1,900 samples that they have processed this year, and I've sorted them by concentration. And so obviously on the far end, we've got our zeros down here, and they're sorted up that way. So the top number up here on that scale, you may not be able to see that, is 100 parts per billion. And so just to point out a few numbers for you, in over 40% of these samples, there was no detectable aflatoxin at all. I want to point out too, Lincoln Inspection Service receives samples from about 100 miles radius around them. So we're talking about most of southeast Nebraska that would be represented in this. They are not randomly collected samples. These are samples where people may have voluntarily submitted them in an interest of finding out what the concentration is to judge whether or not they wanted to feed that lot. And so 42% did not have any detectable aflatoxin at all, and that's fabulous news. When you look a little bit more closely, what you'll find is that in almost 80% of these samples, they're less than 20 parts per billion. And at less than 20 parts per billion, anything can be fed that grain, whether it's for human consumption or any of our dairy cattle, all the way up through our finishing cattle. That's about 80% of our corn is completely safe and okay to feed for all of these groups. And so when you look a little bit more closely though, we do have a few samples, we're talking about 18 to 19%, that are between 20 and 100 parts per billion. But over 99%, we're talking about 99.5% of our corn is still fine, less than 100 parts per billion, and still okay for feeding, especially to finishing cattle, finishing swine, some of the breeding cattle and swine and mature poultry. And so that's something we want to drive home. Nebraska corn is safe and high quality in spite of a lot of the fear that's out there right now. So these are not random tests, though. Keep in mind these are submitted, and in many cases most of these would have come from areas that were some of the heaviest drought damaged corn in the state, probably the highest risk corn in the state. And so my suspicion would be, now that we're harvesting a lot more irrigated corn, these numbers are going to continue to go down. And so I just want to emphasize that. A few things I want to emphasize too for the benefit of our farmers who are out harvesting, and some that are beginning to thinking about harvesting, some especially in our irrigated areas, is that if they're interested and have some concern, they can always go and scout for the disease, and especially focusing on some of our higher risk fields that were drought stressed, non-irrigated, or if they had insect problems or other things that may have damaged the kernels. That produces a high risk scenario. We also recommend that when harvesting, if you suspect you may have an aflatoxin issue or you're concerned about it, I would consider keeping the irrigated and the non-irrigated corn separate. It is more trouble, but if you contaminate the irrigated corn with what potentially could be a little higher concentration mycotoxin like aflatoxin, it can throw the whole load, and the losses for our farmers at the elevator could be much higher. If they have concerns, what I recommend too, go ahead and submit a sample to one of our Federal Grain Inspection Service certified labs. We've got one right here in Lincoln, that's the Lincoln Inspection Service, and several around the state in Hastings, Fremont, and Omaha, as well as up in Sioux City. And so there's lots of opportunities to have that tested for some peace of mind. Also, I want to emphasize, if you do have an aflatoxin or other mycotoxin or ear rot problem, the best rule of thumb is to store the best and sell the rest. The bad news is that even under the very best storage conditions, they are likely to get worse. And so that was something we really want to emphasize. If it's unavoidable and you do need to store corn, we recommend storing it, drying it, and cooling it as quickly as absolutely possible, because that will greatly slow down the spread of that fungus and production of mycotoxins like aflatoxin. And so in particular, storing it for short time periods at less than 15% moisture is recommended. If you're going to store it for several months and you think you've got a problem, less than 12 would actually probably be a better idea. And cooling it quickly too, and keeping those fans running for several days might be required, especially scenarios like we've got right now where we've got highly variable moisture in the fields. And so be aware of that, and putting all that corn in the bin actually is going to promote continued growth in the bin. Some other things that are being reported, and I want to try to get rid of some of the fears and concerns people have. A lot of people are reporting very dusty conditions out there this season, and especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks ago, had a lot of this after a rainfall event that we had locally. And so when you're driving across Nebraska and still got some corn out there, you might notice in some fields we've got areas that look very black and dusty out there. And in fact, when the combine goes through, it might look like it's on fire. There's so much black smoke or dust coming out of it. What we've found out, this is actually fungal spores, massive numbers of fungal spores that are being produced. So these fungi require moisture. We haven't had any in so long that when we did finally get that rainfall event, we had a flush of fungal spore production. And these fungi, for the most part, are the good guys. And so we spend a lot of time talking about bad guys and things we need to be concerned about. These are absolutely good guys. These are the fungi that are going to break that residue down and recycle nutrients back into the soil. Well, that's what they're doing naturally. And so this year being an odd year, we're seeing more of those spores because of that recent rainfall event, and we'll likely see it again as we start to get a little more rain into the fall and winter, hopefully. Lots of things, though. A few things I do want to recommend. If people are prone to respiratory illnesses or distress, you probably should wear a dust mask. This is particulate matter, microscopic particulate matter, and although they don't directly cause disease in humans, if you're prone to respiratory illnesses, you probably should be safe and wear masks. And especially someone who may be immune compromised from diabetes or another medical issue. The surface of that corn, you can even see it on the surface, black patches. You can rub it off on your fingers, and that'll just confirm for you that's what we're talking about. Already this morning, we've talked about other potential problems. Anytime we have stress during the growing season, stalk rots are a potential issue. And if it wasn't bad enough to be worried about the yields being affected, having it all fall down before you can harvest it is another huge problem. And so stalk rots are showing up this year, and so even more reason to hurry up and get it out of the field. And so charcoal rot being one that I'm especially concerned about, and we've seen some here in southeast Nebraska where non-irrigated fields in particular have some charcoal rot. You'll recognize charcoal rot in that lower part of the stalk. It looks kind of charcoaly, honestly. It's kind of black and dusty looking, and that's because of the massive reproductive quantities of reproductive structures in there, small black dots. If you have a magnifying glass, you can see that. This is another fungus competitive in heat and drought conditions. Not one we see very much, if at all, in irrigated conditions. Irrigated fields, much more likely to see some fusarium stalk rot, where you might see that pink or red fuzzy discoloration inside. So lots of things can go wrong. And all this time, all year, I suspected I'd talk mostly about Goss's wilt this year. Well, because of the drought and the heat, this has really slowed down Goss's wilt this year, but I want to remind everybody when, and hopefully when we return back to normal, we're going to see this thing again. It's still out there, and it will survive very well out there in the residue. This is a bacterial disease that has really reared its ugly head again in the last half dozen years. It overwinters for years and years in the crop residue as long as it's there. And from our most recent research, we've learned that the top 5 factors that affect whether or not you have Goss's wilt, number 1, far and away, is the hybrid rating. And so that's the Goss's wilt rating provided by the seed companies. And so that plays the biggest part in whether you're going to develop Goss's wilt or not. Second, we've got some information telling us that planting population, crop rotation, planting date, and crop residue, or the percent of crop residue, are all very important contributing factors to that as well. Now, many of these things are going to require some ground truthing. These data and results came from a multi-state survey funded by the North Central Regional IPM Center. And so it was to help us focus our research efforts on what factors we need to focus more research on. And so here it is, folks. Make sure that you and your farmers are paying close attention to those Goss's wilt ratings, even if you haven't seen it in a couple years or more. So anyway, I think that's my take-home message for today, and I wanted this to be more of a discussion than a lecture, so let's address any of your questions that you might have.